Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to go through a practice lab exam for Anatomy and Physiology 1, and this is the first lab exam or first lab practical. The topics that we cover at my college on this first lab practical are the introduction to A&P labs, so that's like anatomical terminology and the body regions and specific, anatomical terms for the body parts, the abdominopelvic regions and quadrants, body cavities, all of that introductory material. We also cover the cells, so that's the different organelles, different parts of a cell, as well as tissues, which at least at our college, tissues is a really big chapter. So a large part of the exam is on the tissues, identifying a different type of tissue when you look at it under the microscope, or talking about, where the tissue is or what the function of the tissue is. This is just kind of a sample. There are a ton of slides. There are over 70 slides. So there's lots of different information just showing you the different types of questions that you could be asked. That should guide you when you're studying a little bit. This is not guaranteed to be, everything or anything you could be asked because there is more information in the actual labs themselves, but it's a pretty good sampling. So if you're really comfortable with everything on this video or on this PowerPoint, I'm confident that you're going to do really well in the exam. So first are the abdominopelvic regions. This question says, identify the abdominopelvic region with a 1. So that means we're identifying this abdominopelvic region right here. I know that the top two, like the outer two abdominopelvic regions right here, are the hypochondriac regions because they're underneath the cartilage. All of this right here in the rib cage, this is all cartilage. So cartilage is chondro. So under the cartilage is hypochondriac. Then we just need to know left and right. Remember that it's the person's left and right. It's this patient's left and right, not mine. And since they're facing me, it's going to be opposite. So that means that this over here is the patient's right side. This is their left side. So if I'm going to identify this abdominopelvic region right there, that is the right hypochondriac region. Identify the abdominopelvic region with a 2. So that's this top middle region right here. We said that the outer ones, 1 and 3, those were hypochondriac, but this one in the middle is named differently. This one in the middle is called the epigastric region. The epigastric. The reason it's epigastric, epi means upon, and gastro refers to the stomach. So it's like upon the stomach, the region that sits over the stomach. And if you look at the organs underneath here, this is the stomach. So epigastric. Identify the abdominopelvic region with a 5. This one right in the middle of that tic-tac-toe board happens to sit right where the belly button is. So if this guy had skin covering all of these organs, you would see that his belly button is like right here. And you can kind of imagine that, right? Like on your stomach. Because that sits right over the belly button, we name that region the umbilical region. Umbilical. Your belly button is technically called your umbilicus because that's where the umbilical cord attached when you were a baby. That's how you get a belly button, right? The umbilical cord is tied off or clamped, and the little like scar that's left over is your belly button. So that's the umbilicus. So the region where the umbilicus is the umbilical region. That's kind of like the easiest one to identify, I think. Abdominopelvic region with a 6. So this one right here can be called a couple different things. On either side, 4 or 6, those are both either referred to as the flank or lumbar region. Flank is like the side, right? So that makes sense. And lumbar, because if you kind of grab that region right there, right? Like grab the side, if you look around, look, like that's in the lower back area, right? And the lower back is the lumbar region. So that makes sense. It's flank or lumbar. And then again, left and right. This is on this side over here, right? And that happens to be the patient's left, okay? Not my left, their left. So that is the left lumbar region or left flank. 7, now we've moved down a little bit. These two regions right here, those are like right where the crease is between your pelvic region and your leg. So like if you were to fold over, like fold your leg over like that, that crease that's right there. And that is the inguinal region in general, or the iliac region. So those names transfer to the abdominopelvic regions. You guys already know that this is the right side. So that's the right inguinal region, or you could say iliac. That would be okay as well. Right inguinal region. Finally, identify the abdominopelvic region with an 8. This one right here is the hypogastric region, or you could call it the pubic region. It's down in the pubic area. Also hypogastric, remember up here, number 2, that was epigastric because it sits right over the stomach. This is hypogastric. Hypo means below. So this is down below the stomach, down below most of the GI tract in general. It's down more where like the bladder and the reproductive organs are. So that's hypogastric. Now, people get these mixed up sometimes. Those were abdominopelvic regions. These are abdominopelvic quadrants. So don't get them mixed up. The question will ask for an abdominopelvic quadrant or an abdominopelvic region. If you mix those answers up, it's going to be wrong. Quad means 4, right? So there are 4 quadrants. There are 9 regions. For the regions, remember we drew like a tic-tac-toe board like this with lines just inside the nipples, and then there's lines like underneath the ribs and then at the top of the hips. That's how we made the regions. But to make the quadrants, which are bigger and kind of more simple, you just draw a plus line that intersects at the belly button or the umbilicus. Again, these are a lot easier to deal with. I like to use these more frequently because again, it's just much easier to deal with. The spaces are larger, so you can say, you know, the liver is over here in this quadrant. You can say the appendix is down in this quadrant. The pancreas and spleen are in this quadrant, right? It's a lot easier to assign things to a quadrant because they're bigger than it is to assign them to a region. Anyhow, identify the abdominopelvic quadrant with a 1. So these are super simple to name too. It's just upper and lower and left and right. So left and right are the only things that you might mix up. Remember, it's not your left and right, it's the patient's left and right. So you kind of have to like flip yourself around, right? It's opposite. So this over here is the patient's right, this is their left. So number 1 is the right upper quadrant. Okay, the right upper quadrant. Identify the abdominopelvic quadrant with a 4. Again, these are the quadrants, not the regions. So this quadrant right here is on his left side. So that's the left lower quadrant. Pretty simple. Now, I do want you to kind of know some of the key organs that are in each quadrant. Now, I won't ask you things like the small intestine kind of wiggles its way through most of the abdomen, so it crosses through to a lot of different quadrants. But there are some key things that are located in each of the quadrants. And these are important clinically. We do use this clinically. So for example, the liver. The liver is found mainly in which abdominopelvic quadrant? So first off, remember quadrants are the right upper, left upper, right lower, left lower. The liver is on the top right of the abdomen. Hey, tucked kind of up under the ribs a little bit, but the top right. So the liver is in the right upper quadrant. And again, the reason that's important is when somebody has, severe hepatitis or some sort of, liver failure occurring, there can be swelling and pain in the right upper quadrant, okay, because that's where the liver is. Same thing for the appendix, right? When somebody has appendicitis, they have very classic presentation with pain in the specific quadrant where the appendix is. The appendix is down lower in the belly, but it's still on the right side. So the appendix is in the right lower quadrant. And so if a patient has really severe, sharp right lower quadrant pain, I would be worried about appendicitis. The spleen is found in which abdominopelvic quadrant? So the spleen, also the stomach, and the pancreas, these are all really closely associated with each other. The spleen, the stomach, the pancreas, and they're all tucked up kind of next to where the liver is. So the liver is really big up on the right side, and then if you move towards the left, that's where you see all of these other organs. So these are up in the left upper quadrant. I typically don't ask about the left lower quadrant because that's really just mostly, as far as the GI tract goes, mostly intestines, like the very end of the large intestine. And then there's some small intestines wiggled over there, and then there's some reproductive stuff over there. So it's not as specific, but these are really clear. So we talked a lot about anatomical terminology. So you guys had to learn some like prefixes, word roots, and suffixes to learn how we put words together to come up with all of these technical terms. So you guys should know, or at least be familiar with, the examples that we went through in the lab manual and some of those words that are in the chart in your lab manual. So using anatomical terminology, what is the technical term for inflammation of the liver? We use inflammation a lot, and this is the suffix itis. So the word ends in itis. The liver is hepato. So if we put hepato and itis together, we get hepatitis. Hey, hepatitis, which I'm sure you've heard of hepatitis, right? That's a disease that affects the liver. It's a virus that affects the liver and the liver swells. So hepatitis. You could use this itis with a lot of different things. So the stomach is gastro. So inflammation of the stomach would be gastritis. The gums are gingiva. So inflammation of the gums is gingivitis. Right? So you'll see itis a lot. Oh, I always think in the same pattern. What's the technical term for inflammation of the stomach? I just said it. Hopefully you guys learned and you're right now saying gastritis. So we talked a lot about the body cavities. right? Remember, in general, we have a ventral body cavity in the front and then the dorsal body cavity in the back. And then those get broken up into smaller and smaller and smaller cavities. This question says, identify the specific cavity that holds this organ. Well, first off, what's it pointing to? Right, that's one of the lungs. These two kind of pink organs on either side of the chest, those are the lungs, right? And then right in the middle of them sits the heart. So there are multiple cavities that are present up there in the chest, right? Remember, above the diaphragm, so like all of this is the thoracic cavity, but that is not what this question is asking for. Hey, this question says the specific cavity that holds this organ, specific. Okay, so the thoracic cavity holds, you know, the lungs, the heart, the thymus, the esophagus, lots of stuff. But within the thoracic cavity, there are multiple smaller cavities. The cavity that specifically holds the lungs is the pleural cavity. Okay, pleura refers to lungs. So the pleural cavity. Okay? If you wanted to be super, super specific, I guess you could say right pleural cavity, but you don't have to do that right now. You can just say pleural cavity. We also talked about the membranes that line these organs and these cavities. People frequently confuse the name of the membrane and the name of the cavity. So like people might answer the pleura. No, the pleura is the membrane. The cavity is the pleural cavity. Okay. The area posterior to the peritoneal cavity is the, so posterior, you guys should know from the directional terms, posterior means behind. You guys should also know the peritoneal cavity is a subcavity down in the abdomen. So there's this like membrane and kind of cavity that goes like through here, down through the abdominal cavity and a little bit through the pelvic cavity. And it's on the front side of the belly. Now there's some organs back here that are behind the peritoneal cavity, like the kidneys, for example, are behind the peritoneal cavity. And we refer to that area as a specific space. That area is the retroperitoneal space. Okay, so the area is the retroperitoneal space. Here you can see one of the pictures where we see all of the body cavities. Identify the cavity indicated by the bracket. So you can see that the bracket, right, is identifying this whole cavity. So everything above the diaphragm, this little like curved pink line right here, that's showing you the diaphragm, the big muscle that's like right here that separates the chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. So this is asking for this whole top chest cavity. That we said is the thoracic cavity, thoracic. Now inside of that we have pleural cavities and pericardial cavity and mediastinum, but the whole chest cavity is the thoracic cavity. Identify the cavity indicated by the bracket. Again, this is referring to the whole cavity below the diaphragm. There are multiple subdivisions down here, but the bracket continues from the very top all the way down to the very bottom. So there should not be confusion as far as what we're asking for. It's that entire area. That whole area below the diaphragm is the abdominopelvic cavity. Abdominal, like abdominal, that's this light blue part. Pelvic refers to this darker blue part. Abdominopelvic cavity. So thoracic cavity up top, abdominopelvic cavity on the bottom. Which body cavity holds the liver, stomach, and small intestines? So you guys should be familiar with the organs that are in the different body cavities. So for example, we learned already that the lungs are in the pleural cavity. right? The brain is in the cranial cavity. For example, here we're saying the liver, which you guys know now is in the top right, the stomach, which is in the top left, and then the small intestines, which kind of curve down most of the belly area. That body cavity is the abdominal cavity. So here you kind of have to use your judgment, right? Abdominopelvic, the abdominopelvic cavity does have these organs in it, but that's not specific enough, right? Because it also has a lot of other organs in it as well. The abdominal cavity, though, is specific. That's telling you, you know, just the most specific cavity that houses those organs. You could also say the peritoneal cavity. I would be okay with peritoneal as well. Identify the cavity within the yellow circle. So we've already seen this picture. Now this is asking for one of the more specific cavities down here at the very, very bottom of the abdominopelvic cavity. Again, remember that the abdominopelvic cavity can be divided up into like the light blue area at the top and then the dark blue area at the bottom. And the dark blue area at the bottom within the yellow circle is the pelvic cavity. Which body cavity contains the bladder, the rectum, and the reproductive organs? The bladder, you guys should know, is pretty low down in the abdominopelvic area. The rectum is the very end of the GI tract. So that's literally where feces or poop goes before it leaves the body. You can imagine that all of that is really low down in the abdominopelvic cavity, as well as things like, by reproductive organs, I mean like the prostate in men, the uterus in women, the vagina. These are all really low, so those are in the cavity that we just looked at on the last slide, which is the pelvic cavity. So the abdominal, most of the GI tract is up in the abdominal cavity, except for like the very end of it. And then the bladder, all of the reproductive stuff is down really low in the pelvic cavity. We learned a lot of different anatomical terminology. So in anatomy and physiology, we'd like to make things hard. So this is no longer your nose, right? We learn a specific anatomical term for the nose. And that anatomical term is nasal. Okay, nasal. So if you have a fracture, that's a nasal fracture. Okay. Identify the anatomical region. So the anatomical region here for the arm, right, is brachial. And you guys have in your lab manual like a whole list of these, right? You literally go through like the whole body, learning all of the different parts, and you'll just have to memorize them. You can be thinking about them all the time though, right? Like while you're driving, you can talk through and practice them on yourself. Or if you have kids, you can, play with your kids and practice them with them, or practice pointing them out on your spouse. Write them on tape and put the labels on your husband. There's so many different ways that you can practice these, but the arm is brachial. And I'll tell you, these are really important for you to learn because these come back over and over and over again. The regions very frequently correlate with the names of the bones or the names of the muscles or the names of the arteries and veins that are in the area. So for example, there's a brachial artery that goes through the upper arm. If you remember the term brachial, that will make the arteries and veins much easier. The forehead is frontal. That bone that's right there is the frontal bone, right? The muscle is the frontalis. So if you understand these regions and the terms really well, it's going to help you through the rest of A&P 1 and A&P 2. What is the anatomical term for the neck? The neck region is cervical. Cervical. And then remember, we already said the lower back is lumbar. Cervical, lumbar, those go along with what we call the vertebrae in that area. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae in your neck. you have 5 lumbar vertebrae in your lower back. Identify the anatomical region. So there are a couple different ways that you could answer this one, and I would accept either answer. This is pointing to like the shoulder region, right? The shoulder, depending on really if it's like right here or back a little bit, could be called deltoid. Okay, deltoid, and this is your deltoid muscle because the region is deltoid, or acromial. There's a process, a point of your, a part of your scapula, your shoulder blade that sticks out right here, and it's called the acromion. So like you can feel it. If you feel here on your shoulder, you feel this little like bone that's sticking up right there. That's the acromion. So acromial is where the acromion is. So deltoid or acromial would be okay for the shoulder. What's the anatomical term for the lower back? I hope you're yelling lumbar because we talked about it twice now. Using the correct directional term. For some reason, directional terms really just confuse some people. For other people, it's super easy, and I don't know why, but for some people, it's really, really hard. So there are all different types of directional terms, and these are just like up, down, front, back, higher, lower, but we use technical terms now, like superior, inferior, right? Instead of inside and outside, external, internal, or superficial, deep. So they're normally in opposites like that, but for some reason they just seem to confuse people. Now, when we use directional terms, we assume that the person's in the anatomical position. So they could be like curled up on the floor, but we still use the terms as if they were like this. That's legs are straight, my toes are forward, my arms are straight, my palms are forward, head is forward. So I can be like this, but you know, if I have a wound right here, I'm still going to describe the location of that wound as if I was like this, right? So it's still going to be, for example, distal to my elbow, even though, you know, it might be above it because I'm like that. So these, sometimes I think what's helpful with these is if you just, you know, use a general term first, like fill in the sentence with like a normal term that makes sense, and then match up the technical term with that normal general one. So the index finger, right, that's your pointer finger here, but it doesn't really matter. It could be any of the fingers, and this would be the same, is blank to the wrist. This is the wrist. Okay, so imagine if I was in the anatomical position, my hand would be, you know, like that, and the finger is what to the wrist. So if I have my wrist right here, to get to my finger, right, the finger is more distal. Okay, distal is the most appropriate term. Proximal and distal really apply most to the arms and the legs, but what they mean, proximal means close to the site of attachment. Distal means further or distant from the site of attachment. So like on the arm, for example, the arm attaches on my shoulder. So everything on my arm that's closer to the shoulder is more proximal. Everything that's more further away is more distal. So my finger is further away than my wrist, right? My wrist is further away than my elbow. My elbow is further away than my shoulder, right? So as I head that way, everything is more and more distal. As I head this way, everything is more and more proximal. Technically, you could say inferior. It is inferior, like below it, but distal is better. Identify the anatomical region. So sometimes with these, you guys need to use some common sense. Like, what am I actually asking for here? Remember that like from here up, this whole area is the thoracic region, right? But I am not indicating that whole area. Like I'm pointing very specifically to the center of the chest right here. And that was one of the areas you guys needed to learn. So answer it that way, right? Answer that specific area right there in the middle. And that is sternal. Or you could also say pre-sternal. Sternal refers to the sternum. Your breastbone, the hard, like kind of flat bone that's right here in the middle of the chest, is called the sternum. So sternal is like where the sternum is. Pre-sternal is like in front of the sternum, right? Like just before the sternum. The sides of the chest, right, would be pectoral or mammary. Either one would be okay, pectoral or mammary. But this isn't pointing to the sides of the chest, right? It's pointing to just the center of the chest. Using anatomical terminology, what is the correct term for study of the heart? This is like the questions that we did with hepatitis and gastritis, right? You have to take the different word parts and put them together to make a word. You guys should know that heart is cardio. Okay, so anything having to do with the heart is cardio. That's why we call aerobic exercise doing cardio, because it makes your heart beat fast. But a cardiologist, right, is a heart doctor. So cardio is heart. Study of is ology, right? Ology. So put them together and we get cardiology. And you guys have heard that, like the term ology before, biology, physiology. So you've heard that a lot. So anyhow, cardiology is the study of the heart. Here's another directional term. Using the correct directional term, the stomach is blank to the heart. So your heart is right here in your chest, right? You guys should kind of know like the general locations of the organs from when we do body cavities. Your heart is right here in your chest. The stomach, you guys know, is down in the abdomen. Okay, you don't have to know specifically where, but like the stomach is down, actually more over here, but the stomach is down in the abdomen. So if we just use normal terms first, the stomach is what to the heart? The stomach is below the heart. Okay, that makes sense, I think, to most people. The stomach is below the heart. It's down below the heart. So what directional term means below? That would be inferior. The stomach is inferior to the heart. It's below the heart. The opposite of inferior is superior. So I could say the heart is superior to the stomach, right? The heart is above the stomach. Drops that are used in the ear are referred to as what kind of drops? So we have to use our anatomical terms here. Ocular drops, ophthalmic drops, otic drops, nasal drops. You don't have to have seen this question before. This is a brand new question for you guys. I didn't have this on the review or anything, but you should be able to figure this out, right? We already said that nasal means nose. So ear drops for the ear wouldn't be called nose drops, right? That would be, nasal drops would be for the nose, so no. Ocular and ophthalmic both mean the eyes. So ophthalmic drops would be eye drops. So no, that only leaves one, otic. And you guys should know that otic refers to the ear. Okay, so ophthalmic is eye, otic is ear, nasal is nose. So ear drops that are used in the ear are otic drops. Use the correct directional term. The heart is what to the spinal cord? So the heart is right here in your chest. The spinal cord goes down your back. Okay, so the heart is in front of the spinal cord. Okay, the heart is in front of the spinal cord. So what's the directional term for in front of? The term is anterior. Anterior means in front of. The opposite of that is posterior. So if I said the spinal cord is posterior to the heart, it's behind the heart, but the heart is in front of the spinal cord. The heart is anterior to the spinal cord. Situations like this are why directional terms are important. Obviously, every doctor in the world knows where the heart is compared to the spinal cord. You're never gonna say that. But we do use the directional terms when we're talking about wounds, or tumors, or blood clots, or injection sites, anything like that. We do use directional terms. So for example, if you were treating this patient and you had to describe where this wound was, you would need to describe where the wound is intelligently, right? Using directional terms. Well, the abdominal wound is blank to the umbilicus. You guys know that the umbilicus or belly button is right here. The abdominal wound is just below the umbilicus. So we talked about this a second ago. What directional term means below? That is inferior. So if you were treating this patient, you would chart it as the patient has an abdominal wound, you know, whatever, 1 centimeter inferior to the umbilicus. Identify the specific cavity that contains this organ. Again, this is telling us specific, so don't give me thoracic cavity. Yes, this whole chest cavity is the thoracic cavity, right? Yes, the whole front is the ventral cavity, but this wants to know the specific cavity that houses this organ. So first off, what is this organ? Right in the middle of the chest between the lungs, that's the heart. Okay, so what cavity holds the heart? That is the pericardial cavity. Okay, pericardial cavity. Peri means around, and you guys tell me, what does cardio mean? Heart. So around the heart. So the pericardial cavity is the cavity around the heart. Now don't say pericardium. The pericardium is the membrane, but the cavity is the pericardial cavity. Identify the specific body cavity that holds this organ. Well, this is pointing to the brain. The organ that holds the brain is the cranial cavity. Okay, the cranial cavity. Identify this organ. That's the brain. Okay, that right there is the brain. Down here in the bottom, you can see like all the abdominal organs, just to kind of show you the quadrants and where the different organs are. We talked about this earlier. If you draw a plus sign like that to get the quadrants, this big dark thing up here, the dark brown, that's the liver. So you can see that most of the liver is in the right upper quadrant. This is the stomach, and behind it is the pancreas, and the spleen is tucked over here too. So those are in the left upper quadrant. The appendix sticks down right over here, so that is in the right lower quadrant. And then again, you've got a lot of like intestine and stuff over here on the left side. Using the correct directional terms. Again, we've got a wound and we've got to say where is the wound. So the wound is blank to the spine. Well, the spine is right here down the center of the back. The wound is over here. So just use a normal term first. The wound is, you know, next to the spine. The spine is in the middle and the wound is out towards the side. So the wound is toward the side of the spine. When we're talking about in the middle or towards the side, the two directional terms are medial and lateral. So lateral means towards the side. So the wound is lateral to the spine. Okay, the spine is medial, but the wound is more lateral. It's towards the side. This is the model of the cell. We have a couple different models of the cell. These are like the newest ones. These are the ones that we use in Top Hat to go over the different types of organelles. So this is the one that I have on the lab practical this year. But we're just looking at organelles, right? So organelles are just the little parts of the cell. They each have their own special function. We this year are going to talk about the functions in class more. Typically, I would test you on the functions of the organelles in lab as well, but I'm leaving that all to the lecture exam. So as far as the cell chapter goes on this practical, I'm just going to have you identify all of the different parts of the cell. So this is asking, identify this organelle, and this is pointing to this big round structure right here. That is the nucleus of the cell. Okay, the nucleus. Now, there are a couple other structures related to the nucleus that you should also know. One, just the membrane that surrounds the organelle is called the nuclear envelope. So if I, pointed to this outside and I said, identify this specific, membrane surrounding this organelle, that would be the nuclear envelope. Or if I pointed to the little holes here and I said, identify these holes or passageways, those are nuclear pores. But the nucleus is one of the major things. And then the other one that I want you to know is this specific structure inside the nucleus. So the nucleus is like the big whole structure, and that's where your DNA is. This smaller structure within the nucleus is the nucleolus. Those terms are very similar, so don't mix them up. The nucleus is the whole thing. The nucleolus is the little one in the center. Identify this organelle. So any of these little orange things that we're pointing to, like this one right here, or any of these, those are called mitochondria. Technically, mitochondria is plural. If you wanted to say singular, mitochondrion. I don't take off for that though, so if you've already learned mitochondria, that's okay. These are like the powerhouses of the cell. This is where we make all of our fuel, our ATP, to fuel the cell so that it can, have energy and make things happen. The reason that these look a little bit different from each other, this one that it's pointing to is just showing it from the outside. The outside looks nice and smooth. These other ones are showing you once you cut it open. There's like a double membrane. There's a membrane outside and then another membrane inside that's really curvy. So on this, you see this like really curvy inner membrane. That's why they look a little different, but they're all mitochondria. Okay, so even if I point over here, that's still a mitochondrion. Identify this organelle. So these red organelles here, both this one and this one over here, those are called Golgi. That's a Golgi complex. Or you could also call it a Golgi apparatus. Okay, so a Golgi complex or Golgi apparatus. These are packaging plants. They have a lot of different functions. Like they're important for the last step in like modifying and packaging, like enzymes and proteins for later use. They package things into little vesicles. They also are important for producing some carbohydrates. They have lots of different functions, but each of these red ones are showing you a Golgi complex or Golgi apparatus. And you can kind of see a vesicle pinching off of it. Like if you look right here, this little bubble is a vesicle that's pinching off. And then you can see over here, then that's once they're free of the Golgi. This organelle, this is pointing to this structure right here. All of these dark blue kind of membranous chambers, right? Like little storage chambers. All of these dark blue ones, no matter which one you point to, all of those are endoplasmic. It's an endoplasmic reticulum. However, you have to be more specific than that. There are two types of the endoplasmic reticulum. There's the smooth ER or smooth endoplasmic reticulum and the rough endoplasmic reticulum. This one is smooth. Okay, so this, that is all smooth endoplasmic reticulum. It's smooth because its surface is literally smooth. It's a smooth membrane. This over here is the rough endoplasmic reticulum. That's not what this question's asking for. But if I were to point to this other one down here, that would be the rough endoplasmic reticulum. And when you look at the surface of it, you can see these little like yellow dots or whatever. that's showing you that the surface has structures attached to it. The surface is rough. The reason for that is it's got ribosomes all over its surface. The rough ER is important in modification and production, bending into the right shape of proteins. So the ribosomes are attached to it. The ribosomes string together a bunch of amino acids to make a protein, and then they spit it into the rough ER. And the rough ER bends that polypeptide into the right shape to make the protein. So it's involved in protein synthesis, hence the fact there are ribosomes all over the surface that make it rough. Tissues. Everybody loves the tissues. Everybody hates tissues, but they're important. One thing I encourage you guys to do is once you've learned the tissues, mix up the order when you study them. Just the way that our brains work, if you study them all in the same order every time, you're going to memorize the order and you'll know what's coming next. When you mix them up, you'll find that you're like, oh crap, I don't remember, and you get mixed up and stumped. On the exam, they're not going to be in a specific order. They can be all in different order on the exam. So I don't want you to get there and to be like completely thrown off and to say, man, I knew these all when I was studying. Why don't I know them now? Because they're mixed up. Or the picture might be slightly different color, right? Or if you guys are watching this and you're from a different colleges might use different pictures. So with the tissues, I always tell you guys, you've got to learn why it's that kind of tissue. Like you have to look at the picture and analyze it and say, okay, because of the shape of the cell, or because there's no nucleus, or because the nuclei are bunched at the bottom. Like you've got to learn why it's that kind of a tissue. Identify this tissue. So this tissue right here, I know right off the bat, looking at it quickly, that it is adipose tissue. That's just fat. It's adipose tissue. The way I know that is because I don't see a nucleus in the middle of these cells, right? Like this is the cell membrane around the outside. Look at the center. There's no stained nucleus. All of the other cells that we look at, all of the other tissues, you'll see a nucleus present. You'll see like a dark spot somewhere. These are just like these sacks of fat. Technically, these are cells. There are nuclei present, but the nuclei get like squished off to the side. The whole cell is filled with this vacuole of fat. And the nucleus is literally squashed on the side. So you don't really see it, right? Like it's just kind of squished off to the side here. So you see all of these empty cells like this. This looks kind of similar to simple squamous tissue when you look at it from the top. When you look at like a surface view, like if I had a whole sheet of simple squamous tissue, which remember is one layer of flat cells, like we have in our lungs, for example. When you look at that tissue, like if you're looking down at the tissue from the top, it looks kind of like this. There are like tiles, right, or cells that all come together like this. The difference is that simple squamous epithelial tissue has a nuclei in the center of each cell. So if it looks like this, but there's a nucleus in the middle of each cell, simple squamous epithelial tissue. If it looks like this with no nuclei, adipose tissue. Identify the location in which fibrocartilage might be found. So you guys have to be able to identify the different tissues, sometimes point out little things in the tissue like collagen fibers, elastic fibers, reticular fibers, cilia, microvilli, etc. You should also know a little something about where the tissue might be found or what the purpose of the tissue is. Fibrocartilage is the strong cartilage that we have that forms like strong discs between our joints. So you could say forming, padding between bones, or you could say in the like intervertebral discs. So anywhere like in the knee or in the back between the vertebrae, when you have two bones that are holding a lot of weight and they're pushing down on each other hard, we put this nice strong fibrocartilage pad between them, and it absorbs shock, so that the bones aren't like smashing on each other hard. Identify this tissue. This is a type of cartilage. There are 3 different types of cartilage that we had to learn: elastic cartilage, fibrocartilage, and hyaline cartilage. This is a cartilage. All of the cartilages, you'll see like these extra bubbles around the cells. So, and those are called lacuna. So you'll see like this is the cell right here. You can see it's dark nucleus inside. And then notice there's like this extra bubble around it. That's the lacuna, the space that the cell lives in. And you'll see like, so this is another good example. Hang on, let me change colors. If you look inside this green circle here, that's a really good example. You see the cell in the middle, right? It's kind of got nice stain. And then the lacuna around it is perfectly white. Anytime you see a cell in a lacuna like that, it's either cartilage or bone, but bone is super obvious. You'll never confuse cartilage and bone. Bone literally looks like when you cut a tree and you see like the rings of the tree trunk. But when you see like a cell within a little bubble like that, that's cartilage. So I know right away this is a type of cartilage. Then I just have to say, what kind of cartilage is this? This is super obvious, that this is elastic cartilage. The reason I know that is it's so dark. Elastic fibers are really, really dark. So outside of the cells in the lacuna, you see all of these like dark purple lines, all these dark purple fibers everywhere. Those are elastic fibers. So I see my cell inside a bubble, and then I see all these dark purple everywhere. That tells me elastic cartilage. If it was really light pinkish, purplish, and glossy, that would be hyaline cartilage. Identify the location where keratinized, stratified squamous epithelial tissue is found. That is a mouthful. So let's break it down. Stratified squamous. Stratified means there's a bunch of layers of cells. So it's not just one layer of cells. It's cell after cell after cell after cell, all layered on top of each other. Squamous means that the cells are flat. Okay, so we've got a ton of layers of flat cells, and it's epithelial tissue, meaning it's a lining tissue. So it's lining some sort of open surface. It could be your skin, it could be lining your mouth, it could be lining a blood vessel, it could be lining your heart, it could be lining the GI tract, it's lining something. Keratinized tells me that the surface of the tissue is just dead. It's just these dead sacs of keratin. Keratin's a really strong fiber. So there's just a bunch of just dead keratin fibers on the top. There's one location where we should have keratinized tissue, and that is our epithelial tissue. That's our skin lining the outside of our body, in our epidermis. So you could say the skin is where we have it. You could say the epidermis. The epidermis is specifically the outer layer of the skin. Underneath that, we have connective tissue in the dermis. But either answer is okay. You could just say the skin. If this said non-keratinized, that means that there's still a bunch of layers of squamous cells. It's still stratified squamous epithelial tissue. It's still lining something, but it's not dry and dead on the surface. It's more of a moist, smooth, slick membrane. That's like the tissue lining the inside of your mouth. Or a tissue lining like the inside of the vagina, for example. The way I keep track of those is it's like one's really dry and moist. One's really moist and wet and slick. One's really dry. Okay, so if I said non-keratinized, you could say the mouth. Identify the location where reticular connective tissue is found. Reticular connective tissue is kind of special. It has a bunch of reticular fibers in it, and it happens to have a bunch of lymphocytes present, and those are white blood cells. We find reticular connective tissue present a lot in the lymphatic system. So you could say, lymphatic tissue, which is closely related to the immune system, or you could say like a lymph node. Okay, when we look at the lymph nodes, we see a lot of reticular connective tissue. Identify the location where pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue is found. We'll look at this in a little bit, but pseudostratified means like fake stratified. It looks like there's a couple layers of cells, but there's really not. All of the cells actually touch the bottom. And it's ciliated, meaning there's little hairs sticking out of the top of it. Now, pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelial tissue is classic for the respiratory tract. Hey, the respiratory tract. So you could just say the respiratory tract, or you could be more specific, and you could say like the larynx, you could say the nasal cavity, and you don't have to list all of these, right? If you can just give me one location that's correct, that's enough, that's good, okay? The larynx, the nasal cavity, the trachea, the bronchi, okay, any of those are fine. Those are all parts of the respiratory tract that carries air down into the lungs. Identify this tissue. So again, I want you guys to analyze the tissue. Don't just, memorize it based off of the color or what it kind of looks like, because it could be different when you look at it again. So first thing off the bat, I know this is epithelial tissue. So I'm going to write that first. Epithelial tissue. So now what kind of epithelial tissue? Well, the way I know it's epithelial tissue is because it's lining this open space. If it was connective tissue, it wouldn't be lining that open space. So like this tissue down here that we kind of just see the beginning of, that's connective tissue. It's surrounded by cells everywhere. But this tissue, this one layer of cells right here, it's lining this open area. So it's epithelial tissue. Now, to figure out what kind, I have to know how many layers of cells, right? Is it simple or stratified? And then what shape are the cells? To look at this, like one cell, you can see the barrier of the cell, right? The cell membrane kind of around the outside. And then in the center, this darker circle is the nucleus. Okay, dark circle is the nucleus. So each of these is a cell. So this is one layer of cells. Hey, underneath, again, it changes. This is a completely different tissue underneath that looks different. So if it's just one layer of cells, it is simple. Now, what shape are these cells? These are very clearly long, like triangles, really clearly long rectangles. So we call those columns, columnar. So this is simple columnar epithelial tissue. Okay, simple columnar. If these were squares like that, it would be cuboidal. If they were more flat, it would be squamous. Okay, this is simple columnar epithelial tissue. Also, notice how like the nuclei are all in a row right here. They're really nicely organized. If this was what we call pseudostratified, we would have messy nuclei like all over the place down here. Okay, they wouldn't go all the way to the top, but they would be messy all over the bottom. The fact that the nuclei are all in a row really nicely tells you it's simple columnar. This, hopefully when you look at this, you say, oh, I see cells that live in a bubble, right? There are cells in lacuna. That must be cartilage. Okay, you see like, you can see the cell here, you can see the dark nucleus in the middle, and then there's this extra bubble around the outside of them, right? That's a cell in a lacuna. This one's really clear. There's the cell, the dark nucleus, and then there's this extra bubble around it. Okay, that means that this is cartilage. Now remember, we have elastic cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and fibrocartilage. We already saw elastic cartilage. Remember, elastic cartilage, we saw all of these like really dark like purplish blue lines all around the outside. And I said, if it's really dark like that, you see all those elastic fibers, that's elastic. This one you don't. Notice how like pretty and glossy all of this is out here, right? It's really glossy. You don't see the protein fibers. That means that this is hyaline cartilage. It actually does have protein, but it also has these crystals in there that kind of cover it up. So it's nice and pretty and smooth and glossy. That is hyaline cartilage. What organ system is primarily being displayed by this model? So you guys are supposed to learn the organ systems, right? There are 11 organ systems, like the respiratory system, the urinary system, the reproductive system, etc. This model is showing you a bunch of muscles, right? A bunch of muscles are in the muscular system. If I showed you a bunch of bones, like the skeleton, that would be the skeletal system. If I showed you the GI tract, like the stomach and the intestines, that would be the gastrointestinal system or the digestive system. This is the muscular system. To which organ system does this organ belong? So again, what of the 11 organ systems? Well, this is the brain, and the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves are all part of the nervous system, right? The nervous system. What organ system does this organ belong to? So you guys should know again that this is the lung. Remember, we looked at the lungs inside the pleural cavities. The lungs belong to the respiratory system. The respiratory system. What organ system does this belong to? This is your heart, right? You can kind of see like the traditional heart shape, but this is your heart. Your heart belongs, as well as all the blood vessels. So like I could show you, you kind of see the start of blood vessels up here, but I could show you all of the blood vessels going through the body and the blood, and that is part of the cardiovascular system. Remember, cardio means heart, vascular like vessels, so cardiovascular system. Identify this tissue. So again, it might look kind of busy to you, but if you look, there are these open areas right here. This is an open area, a lumen, and it's surrounded by this layer of tissue. So we want to know, what is this tissue? Again, over here, an open area, and it's aligned by this layer of tissue. An open area, and it's lined by this layer of tissue. So because this tissue is lining an open space, I know it is epithelial tissue. I just need to know what kind of epithelial tissue. Again, first we look at how many layers of cells. Now, students want to look at this and say, there's a lot of layers of cells. Look at how the cells are all stacked on top of each other. But they're actually not stacked on top of each other. These are like separate units. So there's, this is one unit right here. This is one unit right here. So like each of these things that I've circled, that is one unit. And in that unit, there is only one layer of cells. Okay, so that means it's simple. Now we just need to know, what shape are these cells? They are kind of square shaped, right? Like, so this is one cell right here. You can see the nucleus in the middle, right? Another cell next to it, the nucleus. Next to it, the nucleus. So these are relatively square shaped. Remember, the columnar cells were really tall, right? They were really, really long and rectangular. These are much shorter and more square. So these are like cubes. So this is simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Simple cuboidal epithelial tissue. Identify this tissue. So what we're identifying is like from here to here. Right, underneath it, this looks different, right? That's connective tissue down there. But you'll notice up here, what's that? That is all open space. So if the tissue is lining an open space, you guys know it is epithelial tissue. And then once you know it's epithelial tissue, again, it's really easy because all you need to do is say how many layers and what are their shape. There's obviously a lot of layers of cells here, right? The bottom layer of cells is way down here, and then look how many cells get stacked on top until it gets to the top. A lot. So that is not simple anymore. Now this is called stratified. Okay, stratified. Now what shape are the cells? These cells are pretty flat, right? They're not like these nice squares all aligned. There's not these rectangles all aligned. It's kind of messy, honestly, but there's lots of like kind of flat cells. So this is stratified squamous epithelial tissue. We mentioned that before, right? Remember we said that there was stratified squamous epithelial tissue in our skin and lining our mouth, but they're different from each other, right? One's wet, one's dry. So we've got to say which is it? Is this keratinized or non-keratinized? Now if you look at this, notice how the cells go all the way to the top, right? There's a cell right there with a nucleus. A cell with a nucleus, right? The cells go all the way up to the top. There's not like a big layer of crap up there, of keratin. So this is non-keratinized. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. I think a lot of professors will accept just stratified squamous epithelial tissue, but for bonus points, learn that it's non-keratinized. And again, that would be like lining the mouth or lining the vagina. This tissue. So again, what we're looking at, you can see like where the tissues are different from each other, right? Right here is where the tissue separates. All down here, that's all connective tissue. What we're looking at is this tissue here. And you'll notice it's lining an open space, right? There's all this open area here. So it's epithelial tissue. Now what kind? Again, you can see that there's tons of cells stacked on top of each other, right? Each of the dark little circles is like the nucleus, so that says there's a cell there. So you can see all these dark circles stacked, so that is stratified. And then just like we saw in the last one, it's squamous cells, right? They're flat cells. You don't see nice squares, you don't see nice rectangles, you just see a bunch of nuclei crammed together. It's pretty messy looking. But this is stratified squamous epithelial tissue, just like we saw in the last slide. But you'll notice a key difference. Look at all of this messiness up here at the top. Notice there aren't any nuclei up there, right? Like the nuclei stop down lower, and up top it's just all of these fibers. This is keratinized. Keratinized. This is keratinized stratified squamous epithelial tissue. If I asked you, where do we have this? This is in the epidermis, right, of our skin, the outer layer of our skin. And all of this on the top is just keratin fibers to help the skin stay strong. Identify this tissue. This is a connective tissue, right? I know that because I don't have like cells organized around an open space. There's little bits of like white, like little bits of open space, but notice there's not cells completely lining that. There's nothing like lining that open space. So I know that this is not epithelial tissue. This is some kind of a connective tissue. So what I want to look at is the pattern of cells and the types of fibers that are there. each of these like little dark circles, these dark purple circles, each of those is a cell. And then you'll see that most of this is taken up by fibers, and specifically collagen. Collagen fibers are normally like a light, kind of a pink color. So all of this that you see, all of this pink is collagen. So this is really densely packed together with collagen. So we call this is a form of dense connective tissue. Now, when we talk about this dense connective tissue where it's really densely packed with collagen, there's dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. So you've got to look at the collagen fibers and see, are they all going in the same direction? Like, is the collagen really well organized, all kind of going together, or is it messy? This is messy, right? Look at the collagen. Some of it's going curved like that, some of it's over here, some of the collagen is going like this and here. It's irregular. So this is dense, irregular connective tissue. Okay, dense, irregular connective tissue. If I ask you where that was, that's like the tissue that's down in the dermis, the area that's underneath, like the bottom layer of the skin, the dermis, has dense, irregular connective tissue. The reason the fibers go in all different directions is because you never know which way it's going to get pulled on, right? It might get pulled, this way, or twisted that way, or pulled this way, so it's got to be strong in all different directions. This tissue, this is a type of epithelial tissue. It's kind of a weird type of tissue, though. It's its own type of tissue, but I know it's epithelial because of all this open space. So the tissue goes from like here up to here. Now, this tissue is called transitional epithelial tissue. This is like the tissue that lines the bladder. There's a couple things you might confuse this with. You might want to say that it's like stratified squamous or something, but these cells are not flat, right? Look at how like rounded these cells are. You might want to say that this is pseudostratified, because when we look at pseudostratified columnar, you'll see that there are nuclei that are kind of stacked like this. But in pseudostratified columnar tissue, the nuclei do not go all the way to the top. They stop like right here. This is the only one that you guys have to identify that has, these nuclei like this that go all the way up to the top, and then these rounded cells on top. Okay, so nuclei go all the way up. The top cells are normally kind of rounded like that in transitional epithelial tissue. Where is transitional epithelium located? Epithelium just refers to the membrane itself. Epithelial tissue is like the kind of tissue. So that's why you see the words kind of different. But there's a transitional epithelium located in the bladder. This is the tissue that lines the bladder. That's why there's multiple layers to protect the tissue underneath. Identify this tissue. So you've got all this open space, so it must be an epithelial tissue, right? It stops here, so it's this top layer. Now this looks stratified, right? Notice, like you see how the nuclei are all kind of at different levels, but it's actually not. This is the weird one that I said is pseudo-stratified. The way you can identify it is there are nuclei that look like they're at all different levels, but they don't go all the way to the top, right? Notice that there's this free space up here without any nuclei, right? So this is pseudo-stratified. Ciliated. The reason I'm saying ciliated is look at all these little hairs on the surface, right? This is the tissue that we said is in the respiratory tract, right? Pseudostratified, ciliated, columnar, because these are relatively long column cells, epithelial tissue. This tissue, so technically this is called areolar tissue. It's a connective tissue. So areolar tissue or areolar connective tissue. In some places you'll just see it called loose connective tissue. It is a loose connective tissue, but areolar tissue is kind of more specific. Again, connective tissue. What you see with connective tissue is like cells scattered throughout the tissue and then protein fibers all over the place. Like with what we saw with dense, irregular connective tissue, there were cells scattered and then there was a lot of really dense collagen fibers, protein fibers. Here you see cells, right? There are cells that are scattered throughout. That's what these little dark circles are. And then the rest of the lines are protein fibers. There are multiple different kinds of protein fibers in here. That's why the lines look a little different. All of these pink lines that you see here, like the kind of wide pink ones, those are collagen. All of these thinner, kind of more dense dark lines, those are elastic fibers. Okay, so collagen is kind of more pinkish and big. Elastic fibers are darker and more dense, like kind of straight lines. Where will you find neural tissue or nervous tissue? In the nervous system, right? So neural tissue is a really specialized type of tissue. And we find it in the brain, or you could say the spinal cord. Okay, the brain or spinal cord. Identify this tissue. Again, this is a connective tissue because you don't see it lining any open spaces. And you'll notice there's cells and then a bunch of fibers, right? So like here's a, let me change color, sorry. Here's a cell, here's a cell, here's a cell, right? There are cells, and then what you mostly see is fiber, right? All of these protein fibers, and this is the pink collagen. Now, there's a lot of collagen packed in, right? There's not a lot of open space like we saw with that areolar tissue. There's a lot of collagen packed in here. So this is definitely a dense connective tissue. The other one we saw was dense, irregular connective tissue, right? The collagen was kind of going in all different directions. This collagen is organized, right? Look at it, like the collagen is all organized, like in the same direction. So this is dense, regular connective tissue, right? The cells are kind of sandwiched between all of the collagen, and the collagen's all going in the same direction. This is like dense, regular connective tissue is what you would find in like your ligaments, ligaments and tendons, because those are like stressed and pulled on in very specific directions. Like you know that the tension on a ligament right here is going to get pulled like this. So you orient the collagen fibers in that direction. It's really predictable. Identify this tissue. This should be pretty easy. It's kind of particular. This is blood, right? Blood is a really specialized form of connective tissue. You see a bunch of blood cells scattered throughout. These, like all of these numerous little red ones, are red blood cells. They're smaller and there's lots of them. The bigger one here is a white blood cell. Now you might look at that and say that's not white, but the reason is because we stained it. We took a sample of blood and we put a stain on it so that you could see the details of the cell. If the stain wasn't there, it wouldn't be colored like that. Okay, the red blood cells though would be. Red blood cells are naturally red on their own. Okay, so the red blood cells and white blood cells are present in the blood. This is a type of muscle tissue. Now there are 3 different types of muscle: smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. This one's really obviously skeletal muscle. There's a few things that tell me that. One, this is obviously striped, right? Like look at these stripes that you see here, right? Dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light. That tells me I'm looking at muscle. And that means it's either skeletal muscle or cardiac muscle. Skeletal muscle has these huge cylinder cells. So like this is one single cell. You might look at that and say, wait a minute, look at all those nuclei. One cell has a bunch of nuclei. So this is one cell with a bunch of nuclei there, right? And then the stripes going across it. So that's skeletal muscle. This is also muscle. If you look closely at it, you can see the little like stripes that are present, right? You can see how there's little variations in like dark light, dark light, dark light. So this is also muscle tissue, but it looks very different from the other one, right? It's not like these huge long cylinders that we see in skeletal muscle. This is cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle has these cells that are kind of like branched and connected to each other, like that's one cell. You see the nucleus in the middle, and then again, these little stripes. One clue that tells me this is cardiac muscle, like we find in the heart, is that every once in a while you see this really dark vertical line, right? You can, now that you know you're looking for them, you can probably pick out a lot of them. Those are called intercalated discs, but these are really special connections between neighboring cells. They're absolutely necessary for heart muscle to work. So when you look at it, you'll see, okay, I see some stripes in there. Those are striations. It's striated, so it must be, you know, some sort of cardiac muscle or skeletal muscle. Every once in a while, I see these like dark connections between the cells. That's cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle looks different. Smooth muscle doesn't have striations. That's why it's called smooth. But it's like these spindly cells like this, like these long, thin, spindly cells. So it looks very different. Identify the function of cardiac muscle tissue. Well, cardiac muscle tissue is in the heart, right? Cardio means heart. So the function of it is it contracts, right? Muscle tissue contracts. And when it contracts, it pumps blood. So the function of cardiac muscle tissue is to pump blood. Identify the function of neural tissue. We already mentioned that neural tissue is found in like the brain and the spinal cord. Neural tissue is highly specialized for communication. So like intercellular communication. It receives signals from the body. The cells communicate with each other to figure out what to do, and then it sends commands out to the body to tell the body how to respond. So there's always all of this intercellular communication happening with neural tissue in the brain and spinal cord. Wow, kind of changed gears. Identify this anatomical region. So this is referring to this top part of the leg right here, and that is femoral. The bone that's there in the thigh is the femur. So femur, femoral, that's the femoral region. This anatomical region, so this is pointing to the back of the knee. And depending on what resource you use, this will be named differently. So I prefer the front of the knee as patellar, and then this, the back of the knee, as popliteal. Okay, patellar in the front, popliteal in the back. You can also say, you know, the anterior knee or front of the knee. Anterior or front of the knee, and then back here, the back of the knee or posterior knee. For some reason, the new edition of the book has kind of gone to these more basic descriptions instead of patellar and popliteal. Identify this tissue. So this tissue is really distinct because it has these huge, like star-shaped cells. There's also a bunch of little cells. So each of these little dark dots, these are little tiny like helper cells. But then this big, huge star-shaped cell here tells me that this is nervous tissue. So we've seen all types of tissue. We've seen epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Those are the 4 types of tissue. Okay, but this is nervous tissue. The cell at the tip of the arrow, this big star-shaped cell, is the key functional cell in nervous tissue, and that is a neuron. All of the little cells are called neuroglia. Neuroglia literally means neural glue. Those are like the support cells. So all these tiny little cells, their whole job is to help support the neuron, to protect the neuron, to keep the neuron healthy. But it's this actual big star-shaped cell, this actual neuron that's actually responsible for, communicating, intercellular communication. Now, not all neurons are shaped this way, but this is the most common type of neuron that looks like this. It'll have little chemical messengers that come in through or messages from other cells that come in through these branches. And then it'll process all those signals, and then it'll send a signal out to another cell. But for our purposes, you guys just need to know this is a neuron, and this is nervous tissue. These other little cells here are neuroglia. All right, I think that's it. 72 slides later. Hopefully that prepared you guys pretty well. Again, these are not every single question that you'll see, but these are the types of questions that you'll see. So you should be able to use this knowledge, go back through your lab manual, and know exactly what to focus on now. All right, thanks guys, have a good one.